In this video, I'm going to be looking at symbol. Now, I'm going to look at some scholarly input in terms of symbols, but I'm going to start off with introduction of some key terms. And then the strengths and the weaknesses of symbol. I don't think I'm going to get a chance to discuss in this video, so you can find it in a table on my blog along with the video. Okay, so let's start. Now, an important place to start is the definition of a symbol. What is a symbol? Now, a symbol is described as something that we use from the ordinary world to communicate meaning about something which is from the supernatural world, extraordinary, something which we cannot understand, which is not ordinary, extraordinary basically. And there is two distinctions that we need to understand. The first distinction is between a sign and a symbol, and the second distinction is between equivocal language and univocal language. So let's start with sign and symbol. Now, a sign simply merely represents something. So in a traffic light, the red light merely represents stop, and then on the green light, it simply represents go. When you're in a classroom, a child puts their hand up, it simply represents I want to answer this question, or I want to say something. Whereas a symbol possesses a more deeper meaning. It goes one level forward. So what kinds of things would a symbol do? Well, if you look at the crucifix, for example, you can say it's a sign because it represents Jesus' death on the cross, blah, blah, blah. But you could also say that actually it is a symbol. Why? Because it represents a deeper meaning that God is involved with his people. He's doing things in the world. He forgave our sins, things like that. You can extract a more deeper meaning. Therefore, it's a symbol. So that's the first distinction. The second distinction is between univocal and equivocal language. Now, the reason this is so important is because Aquinas says something in relation to this. And what Aquinas says, I think, is a very, very good point to use when talking about symbols. So, univocal language is simply when we use one word, like wisdom, and when we apply it to God, so we say God's wisdom, it means exactly the same thing as on a human level. So John's wisdom means God's wisdom. But I mean, can human language really be used to describe something transcendent, or powerful, or being just such a mysterious being outside of this world? Can we really use our language to say, yes, he has the wisdom that we have? Surely he has something more. That's why we can't use the word wisdom. And then the second type of language is equivocal language. So you might say that when you say God's wisdom and you say John's wisdom, they mean completely different things. So even though it's the same word, wisdom, what it means when we talk about John is 130% different to when we say what it means about God. They're completely different. It's evocal language. However, in situations like this, when you use equivocal language, you begin to think, what do we actually understand by God's wisdom? We don't really understand much, do we? Because it's completely different and it's not really communicating something, hence it's failing to do what it's supposed to do, which is communicate information. So what Aquinas did is he said religious language is not equivocal, it's not univocal, is simply analogous. Now what he means by this is that God's wisdom is analogous to human's wisdom. That means that we can understand that God is wise, intelligent, experienced, but we won't fully understand it because we can only understand some of the attributes we've seen on a human level. There's something beyond that which we can't understand, but we can understand a little bit because it's analogous. So when we look at symbols, what we can say is that actually they're analogous. You know, what I'm trying to say is that symbols, like religious language, they're not equivocal, they're not univocal. If we use Aquinas' theory, what we can say is that they're simply analogous. Because if you start saying that they're univocal, then again we go to the problem we before discussed, and equivocal, again the problem we discussed. So that's basically my introduction into symbols. Now I want to talk about three scholars, but then I also want to talk about Wittgenstein because he's very important to this debate. But I think more than Wittgenstein or any other scholar, the most important scholar is Paul Tillich. He is known to be talking about religious language in terms of symbol and all that. So he starts with saying the first important point to note about Tillich, there's about 5 points, is that he says that God is being, not a being, he's being. So he's here on the earth. He's not a being external to the earth. And the reason why this is important is because he goes on to his second point, which is like conclusion. He says, only symbolic language can really do justice to any attempt to explain God's activity with mankind. And the reason why, because God is being, he's not a being. So we can't simply say he is all loving, all that. We have to use symbolic language to explain it, because it's not an external being we can talk about. He's a being, he's here. And it's also good because it avoids anthropomorphic descriptions of God. It's not fact. These are some of the points Tillich says. And he says you can't basically do without them. You can't imagine Christianity without the cross, without the crucifix, the lighted candle, the sacramental bread. You can't imagine Christianity without it. It just doesn't work. We need symbols, albeit for ritual usage, but we also need it for communication. That's the most important thing we need symbol for. And he goes on to describe it as poetic and symbolic language. You know, it is the way to discuss religious language. And then he also gives an example of a symbol. So he talks about the lighted candle, and this obviously shows that Christ's presence, but from this we can imply that God is basically continuing work activity in the world, and this continuing activity in the world, because it's a deeper meaning, again it makes a lighted candle a symbol as opposed to a sign. So when we are using religious language, he says what we are doing is we are expressing ultimate concerns. So what does this mean? Well, now I'm going to say something else which might confuse you. When we are expressing ultimate concerns, what we are doing, we're responding to the life of the Spirit in every human. We're responding to the life of the Spirit in every human. And what this means is that basically we're accepting, embracing, we're understanding new realms of reality and the deeper truth within life. That's what we're doing when we use religious language, and symbols help us do this because we can't do it without it, because it communicates successfully a deeper meaning. And obviously though, even though they're so important, what we have to remember is that sometimes symbols go out of fashion and we don't use them anymore. For example, the Protestant denomination in Christianity, they don't have much value anymore for the virginal conception of Jesus. It's not as important. So this makes us sort of question what Tillich is saying. Is it really important in terms of religion can't do without them? Because there's certain symbols which have come and gone. But obviously Tillich would argue there's many which haven't gone, like the cross and the crucifix. And, you know, he would argue it's to do with the communication. It's the message which is most important. Now, Gilkey, which is an American theologian, he was basically following up Tillich's work and understanding, and he said the purpose of symbol is to reflect the ethos of the world. Yes, it's to represent the ethos of the world. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. I won't really go into much to that. But then he also distinguishes that different symbols have different importance. So if you're at a mass, the sacramental bread will have more important than the fish. So he talks about different times and different symbols. They have different values for anyone. That's why we need a variety of symbols, and it's so subjective, and this we can show by the varying importance. And it's also able to articulate religious beliefs which words cannot. We cannot sometimes sit and explain to someone about the death of Jesus on a cross being so important and the message it holds without showing a cross with Jesus on it, the crucifix, without showing it. It's very difficult, is what Gilkey is trying to say. Now, Paul Ricoeur, he also said that the main way for interpreting the significance of religion is symbols. So all these people are really for symbols. And what Ricoeur also says is that the problem of evil can only be explained through symbolic language, i.e. the fall, and we can only explain this through the fall, which is symbolic, and we can use, and this has been going on for so many centuries and everything. It's so important to use symbolic language, and obviously it's extremely important for believers. It's important to point that out. And he says that when he's talking about the problem of evil only being explained by symbolic language such as the fall, he says that it can only be explained through the indirect language of symbols. So there's a greater realm to it than what you see, not just face value. I think I will end with a quote by Rowan Williams, which is really good to use in essays. But those are the three scholars who are really, really important to symbols, who really just emphasize and enhance why symbols are so important to religion. Now, the reason why I want to talk about Wittgenstein's language games, I'm not going to explain it too much. All I'm just going to say is that we can use it to explain and defend the use of symbols, because we can say that the use of symbols was only makes sense to the believer and the group of believers, hence no one else is really there to say whether it's valid or not, and is successful to the believer and it has meaning for the believer, so we should leave it there. And some of the strengths of this, well, it expresses that symbols are non-cognitive, they're not fact. It unites believers in a common bond, which we can see. It allows believers to formulate and use and initiate the rules that they created, with language games. And it defends against logical positivists, although the best defense against logical positivists is just say using the verification theory itself failed, because the whole verification principle is labeled meaningless, so why should we use it? And then on the flip side, some of the disadvantages of using Wittgenstein's language games to explain symbol is that religious claims cannot be looked at as objective truths, even though symbols, like religious language, do claim objective facts, like the crucifix. It claims that Jesus died for his people, things like that. And then you have other negative points. It alienates people who are not part of the game, and it's also really ambiguous. How do we establish which rules to follow? How to interpret these rules, and what are the implications, and how does it work if these rules change? Wittgenstein doesn't talk about that too much. And now I would like to end with Rowan William, the Archbishop of Canterbury's quote, which is important to the discussion of symbol. Now what he says, I'm going to read it. Like all other serious human discourse, religious language requires a symbolic foundation. So I'll read it again. Like all other serious discourse, religious language requires symbolic foundation. Now, that's a really important quote, because I think it's true. Without symbolic foundation, religion in general, it can't function. So please find strengths and weaknesses on my blog. Sorry, this is quite a long video, but there was a lot to talk about. Thank you for watching.